People assume growing up Hollywood royalty guarantees a crown. I'm Diana, 32, and my inheritance was a meticulously planned extortion. During the year's most exclusive gala, my studio mogul father cornered me sign away my intellectual property to my sister, or he'd systematically destroy a 16-year-old actress's life. He smiled, certain he held all the leverage. But as my partner, Julian, stood quietly in the shadows, my father failed to realise one crucial fact. We weren't there to negotiate. We were there to repossess the building. Drop a comment with your city and hit subscribe. The air in the VIP lounge smelled of expensive champagne and cheap desperation. Marcus tossed the 50-page non-disclosure agreement onto the glass table. The heavy paper landed with a dull thud. It was a complete transfer of rights, an absolute surrender of my intellectual property. He wanted me to hand over the core script of a $1.5 billion franchise so Madison could be credited as the lead writer and lead actress. Patricia stood by the window, adjusting her diamond necklace. She did not look at me as a mother looks at a daughter. She looked at me the way a manager looks at a troublesome corporate liability. "Just sign it, Diana," Patricia murmured, her voice smooth and entirely hollow. "Be reasonable for the sake of the family's future." I did not cry. I did not scream. Tears are a currency. I stopped spending on them a decade ago. I looked at the signature line. It required my name, but it demanded my total erasure. Marcus leaned forward, his custom suit creasing perfectly. He methodically listed the consequences if I refused. He would freeze the escrow accounts. He would tie up my independent projects in endless, suffocating litigation. And worse, he casually mentioned Mia. Mia was 16, a bright-eyed child actor who had just started to find her footing in the industry. Marcus controlled her exclusive contract. He held her morality clause. He held her educational trust fund. It was a soft hostage situation, dressed up in legal jargon and corporate letterheads. I ran my thumb along the smooth edge of my leather portfolio. Eleanor, my grandmother, had taught me to read the fine print before looking at the bold numbers. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. A breakdown was something Patricia could easily manage. Silence, however, terrified them. I closed the folder. I did not reach for the gold pen lying beside it. "The drafting process is incomplete," I said evenly. My voice was a flat, unreadable line. Marcus frowned, unaccustomed to anything other than immediate, terrified obedience. "It is a standard transfer," he snapped. "Do not complicate this." But I already knew the architecture of their trap. They wanted me to act out of emotion, to throw a tantrum that they could later use to prove I was mentally unstable. Instead, I stood up. I smoothed the line of my tailored jacket. I looked at Marcus, then at Patricia. They were waiting for a war. I was not going to give them one in a room they controlled. In Hollywood, people do not destroy each other with weapons. They destroy each other with appendices, clauses, and metadata. I knew the exact weight of the paper on that table. I also knew it was utterly worthless. I turned toward the heavy oak door. Patricia called after me, a sharp edge breaking through her practiced elegance. I did not answer. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving the contract untouched on the glass table. The door clicked shut. To the industry press, I was just Marcus's quiet daughter, the one who did not inherit the spotlight, the one who did not belong on the glossy magazine covers alongside Madison. But the press only prints what the publicists feed them. The reality of my life existed in windowless rooms, illuminated by the harsh blue light of computer screens and the endless scrolling of digital legal files. I was a script doctor. More importantly, I was an intellectual property legal advisor. When a $200 million production hit a structural wall, I was the ghost they brought in to fix the foundation. I spent my nights reading through 100-page licensing agreements, searching for the exact moment a creator's rights were quietly stripped away. The air in my office always smelled of stale coffee and ozone. I rewrote the dialogue, repaired the broken character arcs, and quietly signed away the credit. I lived in the architecture of stories. I understood how a single misplaced comma in a licensing agreement could cost a studio $10 million. Marcus thought my work was a quaint hobby. He viewed writers as replaceable typists. He did not understand that the person who controls the words controls the entire universe. It was in one of those windowless editing bays that I met Julian. Julian was an independent director to the public, a man who wore faded denim and spoke in quiet, measured tones. Marcus despised him. Marcus called him a nobody, a pretentious artist without a real box office return. But Marcus, like always, was measuring worth with the wrong instrument. Julian did not just direct films. He was the silent owner of a massive distribution network. He controlled the streaming windows, the international theatrical releases, and the final approval on major distribution pipelines. We never paraded our partnership. We met over coffee in small diners far from the studio lots. We spoke in the shorthand of people who understand how the machine actually operates. Julian never asked me to smile more. He never asked me to step into the light. He looked at my legal markups and my structural edits with absolute respect. "They are building a house of cards," Julian said to me one evening, reviewing a contract Marcus had aggressively pushed through. "And they think they own the wind." I had nodded, sipping my black coffee. We knew Marcus was rushing the new franchise. We knew he was bypassing standard clearance protocols because he was blinded by the potential of a $1.5 billion gross. Julian was the only one who saw the entire board. He knew I was not a victim waiting to be rescued. I was the architect of my own defense. Julian did not offer me pity. He offered me a distribution clause. He offered me the exact point of leverage I would need when the time came. The industry thought Julian was just a guy with a camera. They had no idea he was the absolute gatekeeper to the global market. The truth was hiding. The cruelty of the entertainment industry is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a slow, methodical extraction of your resources. 2 days after the gala, the extraction became intensely personal. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the chain of title documentation for an upcoming project, when my encrypted inbox pinged. It was an internal memo, quietly forwarded by a sympathetic paralegal who knew too much. The subject line was completely mundane, but the attached file was a meticulously designed public relations strategy. The document was titled Madison Redemption Arc. The subtitle read, "Based on Dee's Early Drafts." I opened the file, and the temperature in my apartment seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus and Patricia were not just transferring the copyright of my screenplay, they were stripping my actual life for parts. Years ago, I had written a deeply personal, unpublished manuscript. It detailed the severe childhood anxiety and the crushing isolation of growing up in a house where love was strictly conditional. It contained specific memories, exact phrases I had spoken to therapists, and the precise anatomy of my own childhood trauma. Now, I was reading those exact words repackaged as Madison's backstory. The public relations team had drafted interview answers for Madison to use on late-night talk shows. They had taken a specific phrase I used in my private diaries, a ghost in a house of mirrors, and pasted it directly into Madison's talking points. Madison was going to sit under the studio lights, wipe away a perfectly timed tear, and recite my trauma to sell movie tickets. It was a masterclass in psychological theft. They were manufacturing a sympathetic narrative for the golden child by cannibalizing the ghost. I scrolled through the pages, reading my own nightmares reformatted into easily digestible sound bites. Did Madison know that was the ultimate grey area? Madison was accustomed to being handed scripts and told exactly where to stand. She rarely questioned the origin of her lines as long as they guaranteed applause. It was entirely possible she believed the narrative her team had constructed, or she simply chose to look the other way. The distinction did not matter to me anymore. The machinery of my family had finally crossed the line from corporate greed to emotional piracy. I closed the laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. I did not throw the computer across the room. I did not call Patricia to demand an explanation. Anger is a fleeting emotion, but clarity is permanent. They assumed I would be too ashamed or too fragile to claim my own pain publicly. They calculated that I would stay in the shadows, quietly watching my sister wear my life as a designer costume. It was a brilliant, sociopathic strategy, but they had completely miscalculated the timeline. They thought they had successfully stolen my past. They did not realize I had already comprehensively audited their future. I saved the document to a highly encrypted external drive. I logged the exact metadata. I recorded the time and date the file had been circulated among the studio executives. Every piece of their stolen narrative was now a verified digital footprint. The war had begun. If you have ever wondered why a rational person stays in a deeply toxic system, the answer is rarely a lack of courage. It is usually a hostage. My hostage was named Mia. Mia was 16 years old, a distant cousin who had been quietly absorbed into the studio's talent pipeline when her parents passed away. She had bright, watchful eyes and a raw, untamed talent that Marcus immediately commodified. To the public, the studio was her gracious benefactor. Behind closed doors, she was an asset managed entirely by fear. I drove to the studio lot on a Tuesday afternoon. Mia was sitting on a folding chair outside a massive soundstage, studying a heavily highlighted script. She looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a production schedule that violated half a dozen minor labour guidelines. Marcus controlled her completely. He held her exclusive acting contract. He managed her educational trust fund. Most importantly, he held her morality clause. It was a brutal legal mechanism that allowed the studio to terminate her career and seize all her past earnings for any behaviour they deemed damaging to the corporate image. It was a leash designed to choke. If I declared war on Marcus prematurely, if I dragged the studio into a massive intellectual property dispute without preparation, Mia would be the very first casualty. Marcus would freeze her funds. He would blacklist her name across the casting networks. He would use her as a human shield to force my immediate compliance. I walked over and sat beside her on the hot asphalt. She looked up, offering a small, genuinely tired smile. They changed the dialogue again, Mia whispered, tapping the pages with her pen. It does not make sense anymore. I leaned in, reviewing the messy rewrites. It was sloppy work, authorised by executives who cared about demographics, not narrative integrity. They do not know the character. Mia, I said quietly. But you do. Play the intention, not the ink. She nodded, gripping the pages tighter. From her backpack, a torn call sheet fluttered to the ground. It was covered in her handwritten notes and schedule changes. I picked it up. It was a piece of corporate debris, but in the right context, it was a precise record of labour exploitation. I handed it back to her, pressing it firmly into her palm. Keep everything, I told her, my voice low enough to avoid the microphone booms nearby. Every call sheet, every schedule change, every draft they force you to sign. Mia looked confused. Why, it is just trash to them. Because one day, these little papers will save you, I promised her. I knew the exact date of her early audition tape. I knew the specific servers where the files were stored. Mia had recorded a screen test using lines from Eleanor's protected, unpublished work long before Marcus formally claimed the rights. She was not just a victim. She was the living, breathing proof of their copyright infringement. I was not enduring Patricia's condescension and Marcus's threats because I was weak. I was enduring them to buy time. I had to build a legal fortress around Mia before I burned their empire to the ground. The trap was set. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the true foundational pillar of the studio. She was a legendary screenwriter who understood that a compelling narrative could move markets and shape culture. She also saw right through Marcus's relentless, hollow corporate greed. Before she passed away, she did not leave me a traditional trust fund that I could easily spend. Instead, she left me a heavy vintage manual typewriter and a sealed box of ink ribbons. To Patricia, it was useless junk. To me, it was an archive of absolute power. Eleanor was a brilliant architect of stories, but she was a notoriously terrible typist. She had a habit of constantly transposing two specific letters whenever she used a very obscure, specialised architectural metaphor she loved. She adamantly refused to let her editors correct it. She claimed the flaw was her fingerprint, a way to prove the physical labour of her creation. I spent my teenage years in the quiet corners of her library, reading those original, unpublished manuscripts. I memorised the exact rhythm of her typographical flaws. Marcus always hated those physical pages. He argued that paper slowed down the commercialisation process. He wanted every script digitised, sterilised, and easily transferable to the highest bidder. When Eleanor died, Marcus aggressively cleared out her office, assuming he had absorbed every asset of value into his corporate portfolio. But he completely ignored the ribbons and the mechanical history of her words. He only cared about the intellectual property rights he assumed he would automatically inherit by blood. I kept the typewriter on my desk at home, a silent observer of my late-night legal work. I knew the exact errors hidden in her greatest, unseen works. Those mistakes were not signs of carelessness. They were highly specific cryptographic keys waiting to be turned. Marcus thought he had erased her legacy to build his own. He did not realise her legacy was sitting on my desk. The archive was fully armed. If Marcus was driven by the accumulation of wealth, my mother, Patricia, was driven by the desperate pursuit of visibility. Patricia did not love cinema. She loved the premiere. She viewed the studio not as a place of artistic creation, but as a factory designed exclusively to manufacture the adulation she felt she had been unjustly denied in her own youth. When it became clear that I preferred the quiet precision of the legal editing bay to the glaring lights of a press junket, Patricia systematically shifted her absolute focus to Madison. Madison was incredibly pliable. She was a beautiful, empty mirror that Patricia could endlessly polish. I remember a specific afternoon, years ago, right before Madison's first major screen test. I was standing in the shadows of the dressing room, holding the script revisions I had stayed up all night to refine so the scene would actually work. Patricia was fastening a heavy diamond clasp around Madison's neck. Madison was trembling, terrified of the complex dialogue. Patricia smoothed her daughter's hair. She did not offer acting advice or emotional support. She offered a philosophy of profound emptiness. You just step out and smile, darling, Patricia murmured, adjusting the harsh lighting in the vanity mirror. Let mother handle the ugly things. The ugly things meant the actual grueling work. It meant the writing, the legal clearances, and the intellectual labour that I provided from the shadows. Patricia ruthlessly erased my contributions to ensure the public narrative focused entirely on Madison's innate, miraculous genius. I was the ghost in the machine, maintaining the engine while they took the bows. I watched them walk out into the blinding flashbulbs, leaving me alone in the dim room with the discarded script pages. My mother did not want a daughter. She wanted a red carpet entourage. I stayed in the dark. It is incredibly easy for the public to hate Madison, but the reality is far more clinical. She is a manufactured construct. Years prior, long before the billion-dollar franchise was even a concept, Madison had a casting call for a gritty indie drama. She was struggling terribly. The original character was sharp, deeply cynical, and required a depth of lived experience. Madison simply did not possess. She bombed the first read completely. Patricia was furious, immediately blaming the casting director's incompetence. I saw Madison crying quietly in the studio parking lot, her confidence shattered. I did not console her with empty, meaningless praise. Instead, I walked back to my windowless office and quietly rewrote the audition sides. I tailored the dialogue to perfectly fit the exact cadence of Madison's superficial, breathy charm. I turned a complex cynic into a tragic, easily digestible ingenue. I slipped the new pages to her agent, claiming they were official last-minute studio revisions. Madison nailed the callback. She won the role that subsequently launched her entire mainstream career. The tragic part is that Madison never actually knew. She genuinely believed she had found the character's voice through her own profound artistic intuition. She stood on awards podiums thanking her muses, completely unaware that her muse was the older sister she routinely ignored at family dinners. Her arrogance was not born of calculated malice, it was born of a carefully curated ignorance. My family had built a magnificent, towering glass house for her, and they made absolutely sure I was the one constantly washing the windows from the outside. But a career constructed entirely on someone else's unseen, uncredited labour is incredibly fragile. Madison thought she was ascending to the stars on her own wings. She was only in freefall. Marcus proudly distributed the locked shooting script for his new crown jewel across the executive network. The franchise was projected by financial analysts to gross $1.5 billion globally. He had aggressively stamped his own production company's logo on the title page, legally claiming it was a completely original development. I opened the encrypted PDF on my secure monitor. I did not read it for the plot or the pacing. I read it strictly as a forensic auditor searching for fraud. I scrolled methodically down to page 47. There it was. The protagonist delivered a passionate, lengthy monologue about structural integrity, relying on an incredibly obscure architectural metaphor. And right in the middle of the climactic sentence, 2 specific letters were transposed. It was the exact, idiosyncratic, typographical error my grandmother Eleanor had repeatedly made on her manual typewriter 20 years ago. Marcus had not hired a team of writers to develop a groundbreaking new concept. He had simply taken one of Eleanor's unpublished, heavily legally protected manuscripts from the studio vaults, ordered a cheap digital transcription, and changed the character names to fit current trends. He was far too arrogant to read the dialogue closely, and his assistants were far too afraid of his temper to correct what they assumed was artistic, intentional phrasing. He was about to build a billion-dollar empire on blatantly stolen property. The narrative flow of his so-called original document matched the dusty pages in my personal safe with mathematical precision. This was not a family disagreement over creative direction. It was undeniable proof of intellectual property theft on a massive federal scale. The evidence was mathematically perfect. Julian met me at a quiet, unassuming diner on the extreme outskirts of the valley. The neon sign buzzed faintly through the tinted window. I slid the printed page containing the typographical error across the scratched laminate table. Julian looked at it, his expression remarkably still. He did not express shock or dramatic outrage. He simply processed the data like a chess grandmaster, seeing checkmate in 4 moves. Marcus is moving forward aggressively with global marketing, Julian noted quietly, tapping the paper with his index finger. He genuinely thinks he has the intellectual property locked down tight. I stirred my black coffee, feeling the heat radiate through the ceramic mug. He has a forged foundation. Julian leaned back in the vinyl booth. He did not offer me a romantic, sweeping rescue. He offered me a cold, logistical execution. Marcus desperately needed Julian's vast distribution network to guarantee international theatrical releases. Julian had recently finalised the preliminary agreements with Marcus's aggressive legal team. I had my corporate lawyers insert a very standard, very boring indemnification clause. Julian said, his voice entirely flat and conversational, "Final approval of distribution is strictly subject to a clean chain of title verification, fully audited by our third-party firm." It was a brilliantly lethal manoeuvre. Julian did not have to publicly cancel the deal and risk a messy, protracted breach of contract lawsuit. He only had to demand that Marcus legally prove he owned the script he was trying to sell. And with the forensic evidence I now securely held, proving legal ownership was the one thing Marcus absolutely could not do. The harder Marcus tried to push the movie into theatres, the faster he would strangle himself with his own fraudulent paperwork. The trap was perfectly legal. The first rule of dismantling a hostile corporate structure is securing your vulnerabilities before you strike. I could not launch an intellectual property war against Marcus while he still held Mia's future as collateral. I did not rely on dramatic confrontations or illegal cyber intrusions to solve the problem. I relied on standard, heavily regulated financial mechanisms. On a quiet Wednesday morning, I walked into the mahogany-panelled offices of a boutique wealth management firm in Century City. I did not use Marcus's money. Over the past decade, my uncredited work as a script doctor had been extremely lucrative. I had quietly routed every consulting fee, every uncredited rewrite bonus, into a series of independent, low-yield accounts. I sat across from a fiduciary who specialised in protective assets. I instructed him to liquidate a significant portion of my portfolio to establish an irrevocable educational and living trust for Mia. We structured the legal vehicle with absolute precision. The funds were placed entirely outside the reach of the studio's corporate shell companies. I appointed an independent third-party trustee with strict instructions to disburse funds directly to Mia's educational institutions and housing providers. Marcus loved to use money as a weapon, assuming everyone else was living paycheck to paycheck on his payroll. He fundamentally misunderstood the power of compound interest and silent accumulation. I spent 3 hours reviewing the trust documents, checking every routing number and legal contingency. If Marcus attempted to freeze Mia's studio accounts or enforce the financial penalties of her morality clause, this independent trust would automatically trigger, rendering his financial leverage completely useless. I signed the final page with a steady hand. I was not buying a luxury car or a piece of prime real estate. I was purchasing a human being's absolute freedom from a manipulative system. I walked out of the air-conditioned office and into the blinding California sun. I had successfully removed the only hostage Marcus had left. The studio could threaten Mia's career, but they could no longer threaten her survival. The structural integrity of my defence was now mathematically sound. The funds were secured. My quiet success in the industry continued unabated, a stark contrast to the loud, frantic machinery of my family's public relations team. I was in my home office, meticulously restructuring the third act of a competitor's thriller, when my phone began to vibrate relentlessly. I ignored the calls and opened the industry trade papers online. The headline dominated the front page. Marcus had officially announced the green light for the $1.5 billion franchise. Directly below the title was a glossy, heavily retouched photograph of Madison. She was publicly attached as the lead actress and the primary creative visionary behind the project. They were accelerating the timeline to force my hand. 20 minutes after the article went live, a private courier arrived at my apartment building. I signed for the heavy, rigid envelope. Inside was a newly drafted transfer of copyright agreement. It was far more aggressive than the previous version. Pinned to the front page was a handwritten note from Patricia on her personalised, embossed stationery. It did not contain a greeting. It simply stated that the studio's legal department was currently reviewing Mia's recent social media activity for potential violations of her morality clause. It was a blatant, highly documented threat. They were assuming I was currently in a state of panic, scrambling to figure out how to protect my young cousin. They did not know I had already severed that specific financial artery days ago. I looked at the glossy magazine feature on my monitor, reading the fabricated quotes attributed to Madison about her deep, agonizing writing process. They were attempting to build an empire on a stolen foundation, and they were using extortion to acquire the deed. I did not rip up the contract. I carefully placed the courier envelope, the legal document, and Patricia's handwritten note into a clear plastic sleeve. I filed it meticulously into my evidence cabinet. In the legal world, an unexecuted threat is just a nuisance, but a documented attempt at extortion is a highly valuable asset. Marcus thought he was projecting overwhelming strength. I only saw a desperate man handing me the exact ammunition I would need for the final deposition. The deadline was set. The emotional detachment required to navigate a familial betrayal is a slow, chilling process. The final fracture did not occur over money or public credit. It occurred over a preliminary billing block. As a registered member of the Guild, I had the legal right to request the preliminary marketing and credit materials for the upcoming franchise directly from the registry. I did not need to hack into a private studio server. I simply filled out the standard digital requisition forms and waited for the official PDF to arrive in my inbox. I opened the document, my eyes scanning the heavily formatted text at the bottom of the promotional poster. It read, "Created by Marcus." It read, "Starring Madison." I kept scanning, looking for the one name that legally had to be there. Eleanor's name was completely missing. The original creator, the architect of the entire universe they were about to monetize, had been entirely scrubbed from the record. I accessed the attached administrative logs to see who had authorized the credit waiver. There, verified by a secure digital signature timestamp, was Patricia's approval. Patricia had explicitly petitioned the Guild to remove my grandmother's name, arguing that a deceased classic writer would make the new, edgy franchise appear dated to modern test audiences. She had systematically erased Eleanor's legacy simply to ensure the spotlight remained entirely unobstructed for Madison. I sat back in my chair, staring at the blue glow of the monitor. Any lingering sense of familial obligation I held instantly evaporated. This was not a business dispute. This was the desecration of a legacy. Patricia and Marcus had stripped the copper wire from the walls of a historic building just to sell it for scrap. I realised then that I was no longer dealing with a mother and a father. I was dealing with a hostile corporate entity that had unlawfully occupied my family's intellectual property. I printed the logs. The printer hummed efficiently in the quiet room. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, tracing the digital signature with my eyes. The people who raised me were officially gone. They were strangers now. Marcus's legal team finally grew tired of my silence. They bypassed the courier and sent an aggressive cease and desist order directly from one of the most terrifying, high-priced law firms in Los Angeles. The letter was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It demanded my immediate signature on the transfer documents and heavily cited the non-disclosure agreement I had supposedly signed years ago. They threatened me with millions of dollars in damages if I spoke a word about the origins of the script. I did not hire an expensive defense attorney to fight them. I simply walked over to my secure filing cabinet. I bypassed the digital files and pulled out the physical, wet ink employment contracts I had kept for a decade. I laid them out on the kitchen island. I did not need to search for a loophole. I only needed to read the specific corporate entity designations. The lawyers assumed I was a standard W-2 employee of Marcus's primary holding company. They assumed the blanket NDA covered everything I touched within the studio walls. But I was not an employee. I had meticulously structured my employment years ago as an independent legal consultant representing the Eleanor IP Trust. The NDA I signed explicitly covered the holding company's original trade secrets. It legally could not cover pre-existing familial intellectual property that the holding company did not yet own. Marcus had used a massive and intimidating law firm to fire a blank round. They had fundamentally confused a standard work-for-hire employee with an authorised representative of a sovereign intellectual property trust. I drafted a very brief, incredibly dry response. I attached a copy of the specific corporate designation clause from my original contract. I politely informed the senior partner at the law firm that attempting to enforce an invalid NDA to facilitate copyright theft was a direct violation of California bar ethics. I clicked send. I imagined the senior partner reading the email, realizing his billionaire client had lied to him about the basic structure of the asset. The shield was broken. The time for defensive maneuvers was over. I needed to acquire the actual weapon. I drove to Pasadena, pulling up to a small, unremarkable brick building that housed Eleanor's original estate attorney. He was an elderly, discreet man who operated entirely on paper files and absolute confidentiality. He had been waiting for my visit for nearly a decade. He led me into a quiet conference room that smelled of aged parchment and lemon polish. He unlocked a heavy metal fire safe and withdrew a thick, bound folder. This was not a standard will. This was the irrevocable IP trust Eleanor had established long before Marcus began his hostile takeover of the studio. I sat at the long table and read the foundational documents of my grandmother's true legacy. Eleanor knew Marcus would eventually try to turn the studio into a soulless content factory. She could not prevent him from taking the CEO title, but she absolutely prevented him from taking the core assets. The trust granted me a 15% voting right regarding the primary intellectual property library. Marcus had always mocked that percentage, believing it was too small to challenge his majority control. But as I read the bylaws, I realised the genius of Eleanor's legal architecture. The 15% was not a standard equity share. It was an explicit veto power. The trust stated that any commercial utilisation of the core IP required unanimous approval if the project violated specific ethical standards, including the exploitation of minors and the uncredited use of ghostwriters. Marcus did not own the franchise. He was merely leasing it. And the landlord was sitting in this quiet room in Pasadena. Has anyone ever tried to steal the credit for your hard work? Hit subscribe, because watching them lose it all is coming right up. I closed the heavy folder. I had the verified metadata of the forged signature. I had the financial routing of the hush money. And now, I had the absolute, irrevocable legal authority to shut down a $1.5 billion production with a single signature. I thanked the attorney and walked back to my car, holding the physical weight of my grandmother's brilliant foresight. I held the keys. A massive corporate lie is never a single, solid structure. It is a fragile web of financial transactions, and money always leaves a distinct digital footprint. Marcus had proudly announced to his board of directors that he had secured full creative clearance, casually mentioning a frozen fund of $2.5 million. He framed it as a standard legal reserve, hinting it was an administrative hold related to my so-called difficult behaviour. But I had the internal routing numbers, and I knew how to read a balance sheet. I sat in my apartment tracing the digital wire transfers through a labyrinth of corporate shell companies. The $2.5 million was never intended for my escrow account. It had been systematically divided and funneled into a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware. From there, it was dispersed in highly specific increments. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. I cross-referenced the receiving accounts with the Guild Registry. The names belonged to 4 young, uncredited ghostwriters. Marcus had hired them out of desperation when he realised he could not fully decipher Eleanor's complex narrative structure on his own. He paid them with untraceable funds and forced them to sign backdated, ironclad work-for-hire agreements. It was hush money, pure and simple. He was buying their permanent silence to maintain the absolute illusion that Madison was a solitary, brilliant auteur. I looked at the names on my screen. I did not feel any anger toward those young writers. In the brutal economy of Hollywood, they were merely starving artists crushed by a billionaire's leverage. They took the money because they had to pay rent, unaware they were helping to bury a legend's actual legacy. Marcus thought his money had successfully purchased their loyalty. He completely failed to understand that extorted silence is incredibly brittle. I did not need to confront him with a dramatic moral speech. I only needed to subpoena the bank records. I compiled the digital invoices, the routing numbers, and the corresponding dates into a single, undeniable federal file. The ledger was complete. The fundamental flaw of arrogant men is that they believe their authority supersedes the mechanical laws of reality. Marcus had presented the studio's board with a finalised copyright transfer document bearing my exact signature. To the untrained eye, it looked completely legitimate. But forensic digital science does not care about visual confidence. It only cares about process. I placed the digital copy of the transfer agreement next to an old consulting invoice I had signed 3 years prior. The ink patterns matched perfectly. However, Marcus had used a rudimentary legal trick. He had his legal team lift the signature from the old invoice and electronically append it to the new copyright waiver. He assumed nobody would ever dare to question the authenticity of a document presented by a studio mogul. But I pulled the file metadata. The hidden digital timestamps were merciless. The document claimed to be notarized on a Tuesday in Los Angeles. Yet, the creation date of the compiled PDF was stamped the following Thursday, routed through an internet protocol address located in the studio's private executive suite. Even more devastating, the witnessing signature belonged to Patricia's personal assistant, an employee completely lacking the legal authority to notarize intellectual property transfers. Furthermore, Marcus fundamentally misunderstood the impenetrable architecture of an irrevocable intellectual property trust. This is the absolute beauty of high-level estate law. Once Eleanor placed her original manuscripts into an irrevocable trust, those assets entirely ceased to exist within her personal estate. Therefore, the broad power of attorney Marcus wielded over her finances in her final years was rendered completely legally void. You cannot sell a house you do not legally own, and you cannot license a script that belongs to a sovereign, independent legal entity. Marcus had built a $1.5 billion global franchise on a mathematically verifiable fraud. The truth was not a matter of opinion or emotional testimony. It was a matter of basic, irrefutable server logs and foundational trust law. The math was flawless. The evening before the global premiere was surprisingly quiet. There were no frantic phone calls from the studio, no sudden legal maneuvers from Marcus's attorneys. They genuinely believed they had won the war. Julian arrived at my apartment just after sunset. He did not bring flowers or champagne. He brought a heavy, encrypted tablet containing the final distribution hold orders. We sat at my kitchen island, bathed in the soft amber light of the pendant lamps. The paperwork was ready. We were not going to file a noisy public lawsuit that Marcus could easily spin in the press. We were going to trigger a silent, catastrophic supply chain failure. Julian had the injunction ready to deploy across his entire international distribution network. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the folded, yellowed letter Eleanor had written to me years ago. I traced the faded typewritten letters. She had known I would always feel like an outsider in a family that only valued flash and immediate commercial viability. She had written that true power does not stand in front of the camera, soaking up the applause of strangers. True power stands quietly at the gate, deciding who is allowed to enter the theatre in the first place. I looked across the table at Julian. He nodded slowly, understanding the profound weight of what we were about to execute. We were not just taking down an arrogant man. We were resetting the entire ethical framework of a major Hollywood institution. We packed the metadata reports, the trust documents, and Mia's audition timestamps into a single, slim leather briefcase. If you are ready to see a Hollywood mogul walk into a trap built of his own paperwork, you will not want to look away. Let us head to the premiere. The night air outside felt incredibly sharp and clear. I did not feel nervous or vindictive. I felt exactly like an engineer watching a highly pressurized system approach its absolute breaking point. We were fully ready. The premiere of a highly anticipated billion-dollar franchise is a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses. The Hollywood Boulevard was completely shut down. Massive, brilliant spotlights swept across the darkening California sky. The red carpet was a sea of screaming fans, aggressive paparazzi, and perfectly manufactured glamour. From my quiet vantage point near the secondary entrance, I watched my family arrive. They emerged from a fleet of black luxury vehicles, immediately absorbing the frantic energy of the crowd. Patricia wore a stunning, custom-designed silver gown, waving to the cameras with the practiced grace of a woman who felt she was finally claiming her rightful throne. Marcus stood beside her, beaming with the supreme confidence of an undisputed king. Then came Madison. She stepped out to a deafening roar of applause. She looked breathtaking, performing the role of the humble, brilliant young auteur flawlessly. I watched a reporter thrust a microphone toward her. Madison tilted her head, delivering a heavily rehearsed answer about the deep, agonizing emotional journey she undertook to write the screenplay's darkest moments. She was reciting my stolen trauma with absolute chilling perfection. The studio executives hovered nearby, calculating the opening weekend box office projections in their heads. They saw a triumphant intellectual property launch. I saw an enormous, highly flammable structure completely soaked in gasoline. I did not wear a designer gown. I wore a perfectly tailored, simple black suit. I bypassed the flashing lights and the screaming reporters, presenting my credentials to the heavily armed security team at the private side door. I walked into the opulent, velvet-lined lobby of the historic theatre. The air conditioning was freezing. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase. I was not there to create a public scandal on the carpet. I was there to deliver a fatal, surgical strike where they felt the most secure. I carried the truth. The VIP lounge, located directly above the main auditorium, was an exclusive sanctuary for the studio's highest elite. The thick glass completely muffled the chaotic noise of the premiere outside. Marcus was standing by a marble bar, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, accepting early congratulations from a prominent hedge fund investor. He saw me step through the heavy oak doors. His practiced smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, deeply furious glare. He excused himself and walked directly toward me, his voice a harsh, low whisper designed not to attract the attention of the surrounding billionaires. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this building before I have security drag you out," Marcus threatened, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. Patricia noticed the commotion and hurried over. her silver gown rustling softly. She looked terrified that I might create a scene. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply unclasped my leather briefcase and placed my digital tablet on the nearest cocktail table. I am not here to make a scene. Marcus, I said, my tone as flat as a dial tone. I am here to show you the structural integrity of your investment. I tapped the screen. A video began to play. It was Mia, sitting in a stark casting room. She looked directly into the camera and delivered the exact, highly specific monologue that formed the emotional core of the film debuting downstairs. I paused the video and pulled up the embedded data screen. The timestamp clearly showed the audition was recorded 12 full months before Marcus had officially registered his fraudulent copyright. I then placed the forensic metadata report of his forged signature directly next to the tablet. I pointed to the specific line identifying Patricia's assistant as the illegal notary. Marcus stared at the illuminated screen. The colour rapidly drained from his face, leaving behind an ashen, hollow mask. Patricia pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, realising her own staff had been implicated in a federal crime. They had expected a weeping, emotional daughter, begging for validation. Instead, they found an auditor holding the absolute proof of their destruction. The room went utterly dead. Marcus scoffed at the glowing tablet resting on the cocktail table. He recovered his composure quickly, relying on the sheer momentum of his enormous wealth. He looked at me with a mixture of deep pity and utter disdain. He claimed that a single old audition tape and a discrepancy in digital metadata meant absolutely nothing in the face of a $1.5 billion marketing machine. He stated that the movie was currently playing downstairs, the domestic box office would open in 48 hours, and his corporate attorneys would completely crush my ridiculous claims by Monday morning. He was incredibly confident. He assumed the battle would be fought in a slow, tedious courtroom over the next 5 years. He did not realise the execution was already happening in real time. Julian stepped forward from the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains. Marcus barely glanced at him, still dismissing Julian as a pretentious, financially irrelevant independent director. Julian pulled a sleek black phone from his jacket pocket. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, devastating rhythm of a metronome. He informed Marcus that as of 10 minutes ago, the Global Distribution Consortium had officially frozen the international theatrical rollout. The streaming rights were suspended. The entire secondary market revenue stream, which accounted for 70% of the projected profits, was completely blocked. Marcus stared at him, genuinely confused. Julian calmly explained the mechanics of the trap. The distribution contract Marcus had so eagerly signed contained a non-negotiable indemnification clause. It required a fully verified, legally unassailable chain of title. By presenting the forged metadata and the unauthorized audition tape, I had formally notified the primary distributor of a severe, undeniable copyright dispute. Releasing the film internationally, right now, would make the distributor legally liable for billions of dollars in intellectual property theft. They were not going to take that massive risk for Marcus. Without international distribution, the franchise was a catastrophic financial loss before opening weekend, even concluded. Marcus looked frantically between the tablet, my calm expression, and Julian's cold smile. He finally realised that the man he had repeatedly insulted held the absolute keys to his kingdom. Julian did not need to cancel the contract. He only needed to enforce the rules Marcus had willfully ignored. The empire was completely frozen. The confrontation in the VIP room ended not with shouting, but with the suffocating silence of total financial ruin. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked out, leaving Marcus staring blankly at the marble floor. Julian and I descended the heavily carpeted stairs and slipped into the very back row of the massive, darkened auditorium. The film was reaching its highly emotional, heavily orchestrated climax. The soaring orchestral score filled the massive room. The industry audience was entirely captivated by the spectacle. On the 50-foot screen, Madison delivered the exact lines of dialogue I had written years ago in my cramped, lonely apartment. She wept beautifully, performing my extracted trauma for the entertainment of strangers. I felt absolutely nothing. It was like watching a beautifully painted counterfeit painting being auctioned off to a room full of blind buyers. The final scene faded slowly to black. The auditorium instantly erupted into a massive, thunderous standing ovation. This was the exact moment Marcus was scheduled to walk down the central aisle, taking the stage to accept his glorious validation. Patricia was undoubtedly waiting in the wings, ready to step into the blinding spotlight she craved so desperately. But the massive screen did not roll the standard, pre-approved studio credits. The vibrant colours vanished. Instead, a heavily legally mandated title card cut through the darkness like a knife. It was stark white text against a completely black background. The text was large, unmistakable, and entirely devastating. It read, "Based on unpublished works legally held by the Eleanor Intellectual Property Trust. Authorised representative, Diana." The thunderous applause faltered. It broke apart into a chaotic symphony of confused murmurs. The industry insiders, the powerful journalists, and the rival studio executives stared at the screen in absolute shock. The whispering spread instantly through the theatre like a sudden virus. Madison remained frozen in her front row seat, the colour draining completely from her perfect face. Marcus could not possibly step onto the illuminated stage now. Walking out there would be a public, undeniable admission that he had knowingly built his greatest triumph on stolen, fraudulent assets. The humiliation was absolute, entirely silent, and ruthlessly public. The truth owned the screen. A dying corporate entity rarely surrenders without a final, vicious spasm. The morning after the disastrous premiere, Marcus launched a frantic, heavily funded counterattack. He deployed his massive public relations machine to flood the tabloids. Coordinated articles appeared instantly, painting me as a deeply unstable, fiercely jealous older sister who was fabricating a legal crisis to extort my famous family for a quick financial settlement. Simultaneously, his aggressive legal team filed an emergency injunction in federal court. They officially accused me of sophisticated digital forgery, demanding the immediate release of the frozen distribution rights and threatening a $50 million defamation lawsuit. It was a calculated, terrifying display of power designed to force me into a panicked, highly emotional public defense. I did not go on television to weep or passionately defend my character. I did not engage with the screaming tabloids at all. I remained perfectly calm, operating strictly within the cold boundaries of corporate procedure. I instructed my legal counsel to formally notify the completion guarantors and the massive insurance agencies that the escrow accounts were permanently frozen due to an actively contested chain of title. This is the fatal, invisible blow in Hollywood. Without a clean, verified title, a studio immediately loses its errors and omissions insurance. Without that specific insurance policy active, absolutely no theatre chain can legally project the film without risking catastrophic liability. Marcus's attempt to smear me in the press did nothing to solve his structural nightmare. The studio's board of directors convened an emergency morning meeting. They did not care about Marcus's toxic parenting style or his desperate tabloid manoeuvres. They only cared that his extreme arrogance had jeopardized a $1.5 billion corporate asset. The vote was swift and entirely unanimous. Marcus was stripped of his executive authority and formally removed from the premises before lunch was even served. My quiet paperwork had effortlessly neutralized his loudest weapons. The false narrative collapsed entirely. The dismantling of a powerful titan is remarkably quiet. There are no dramatic explosions or fiery confrontations, only the sad reality of moving boxes and permanently revoked security clearances. I stood across the street from the massive and gleaming glass studio headquarters late that afternoon. I held a warm cup of coffee and watched the inevitable conclusion unfold. Two heavily armed, stoic corporate security guards escorted Marcus out of the very building he had spent 30 years turning into a personal fortress. He did not look like a Hollywood king anymore. He looked incredibly small, carrying a single brown cardboard box containing a few personal desk effects. His customized luxury vehicle was gone, replaced by a standard black town car called by human resources. He looked around, perhaps searching for an audience. But the street was indifferent to his exit. Patricia's fate was equally silent and far more isolating. The wealthy society friends and the elite red carpet publicists immediately stopped returning her calls. The glossy magazines abruptly cancelled their scheduled exclusive interviews. She locked herself inside her sprawling, perfectly decorated mansion, entirely cut off from the public adulation she craved more desperately than she ever loved her own children. Her illusion of superiority was permanently shattered by the reality of their public disgrace. I watched the Blacktown car carry my father away into the Los Angeles traffic. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy or triumphant happiness. I only felt the profound, incredibly clean relief of a structural engineer watching a condemned, highly dangerous building being safely and methodically demolished. The toxic rubble was finally being swept away, leaving clear, unburdened ground in its wake. The suffocating poison of their conditional love was permanently removed from my daily existence. I walked away from them. The following week, the terrified board of directors formally reached out to me, desperate to salvage the massive financial investment of the Frozen franchise. They offered me the permanent position of Chief Executive Officer. They offered a staggering multi-million-dollar salary and total creative control over the entire corporate catalogue. I reviewed the heavy legal contract over a quiet, sunny breakfast with Julian on my apartment balcony. I politely declined their generous offer. Taking Marcus's leather chair would only trap me inside the exact same endless cycle of cutthroat corporate warfare I had just defeated. I did not want to rule their broken empire. Instead, I retained my absolute, unshakable grip on the Eleanor Intellectual Property Trust. Using my accumulated wealth, I established a new, fully independent production and legal firm dedicated explicitly to protecting the fundamental rights of screenwriters and child performers. The very first official action of my new firm was to completely dissolve Mia's original, highly exploitative studio contract. I visited her a month later at a small, deeply respected independent acting workshop in the Valley. She was sitting on a wooden stage, laughing genuinely, holding a worn script she had actually chosen to read. She was completely free from the suffocating, terrifying threat of Marcus's morality clause. Her talent was finally her own property. Julian and I sat in my new office, looking at the architectural blueprints for our upcoming projects. We did not need the shallow validation of a crowded gala or the false, desperate smiles of industry elites. We had successfully built something permanent, firmly protected by unbreakable legal boundaries and genuine mutual respect. The anxiety that had plagued my entire life was entirely gone, replaced by the steady hum of meaningful, honest labour. The new foundation was secure. The most difficult part of the aftermath was addressing the conditional truce. Madison arrived at my new office building completely unannounced on a rainy Tuesday. She was wearing dark sunglasses and a simple beige coat, stripping away the heavily manufactured glamour she usually carried like armour. She looked terrified, exhausted, and entirely lost without the studio machinery telling her where to step. She sat across from my heavy wooden desk, crying quietly. She begged to know the exact truth. She needed to know how much of her celebrated career was real and how much was a calculated lie constructed by our parents. I did not comfort her with false platitudes or soft reassurances. I placed a thick, heavy black binder exactly in the centre of the desk between us. It contained my original dated drafts, the psychological profiles I had written in my 20s, and the exact lines of emotional dialogue she had delivered to win her prestigious awards. I watched the harsh realization shatter her carefully constructed arrogance. It was a brutal, incredibly necessary awakening. She finally understood that she had been floating on my stolen pain, but I did not abandon her to the absolute ruins of her ego. I offered her a strictly conditional truce. I would not use the trust to permanently block her from working in the industry, but she had to start completely over from the bottom. There would be no more public relations machinery, no studio protection, and no stolen words. She had to enroll in actual acting classes and learn to build a genuine character from her own empathy, rather than merely reciting my extracted trauma. She looked down at the heavy binder, then up at me, wiping her eyes. She nodded slowly, bravely accepting the incredibly harsh but fair terms of her new reality. The illusion was finally broken. I sit alone in my quiet office long after the rest of the building has emptied for the night. The city lights of Los Angeles glitter softly through the large glass windows. I look up at the painted wall directly above my desk. I have carefully framed the vintage, ink-stained ribbon from Eleanor's heavy manual typewriter. It catches the soft, warm light of my reading lamp. A small monument to the woman who understood the true architecture of power. It serves as a permanent, daily reminder that true authority does not reside in loud demands, public manipulation, or the frantic pursuit of magazine covers. It resides entirely in the quiet, undeniable precision of the truth. My family aggressively tried to turn me into a convenient ghost to serve their endless hollow ambitions. They calculated my worth based strictly on my willingness to quietly disappear and fix their mistakes. They used the wrong measuring instrument entirely. They handed me a cruel ultimatum, and I used their own paperwork to rewrite the entire legal structure of their universe. Inheritance is simply what someone decides to hand you when it serves their purpose. Worth is what you build with your own two hands when they turn their backs and expect you to fail. Legacy isn't the name they force you to wear, it's the truth you refuse to let them erase. If you have ever had your hard work claimed by someone else, or felt your voice silenced by people who demanded your gratitude for their cruelty, take this as your absolute sign. Build your truth so structurally strong that no fabricated lie can ever stand against it. Share this story with someone who desperately needs a reminder of their own unshakable worth. I will see you soon.